MSOE, your microphone is on.
Dear learners, so welcome you today's session. So Professor Mohanty is present now. He is going to teach you MSOE2. It's a diaspora paper. So ma'am is expert in this. He is teaching in Bani Bihar. So she is a professor in Bani Bihar. Okay. So Mama, she is. I mean, you are very fortunate. You got a very good. I mean, academic counselor. So I mean, due to this pandemic, so I mean, you are connecting through this Google Meet. So I mean, it's very difficult to now move in the outside. So due to this lockdown, the what is the objectives of the IGNOU? The reaching to the on-reach or basically the digital mode. So before to that, you are basically follows the face-to-face interaction. You are going to study center and attending the class, but nowadays this is not possible. So it's a new invention, or you can say it's a using the new technology. So you are connecting each other to this Google Meet. So I mean, ma'am is expert in this paper. So today is the
Hello. Hello. Am I audible to all?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, I'm Dr. Tanaya Mohanty, and I'll be taking up the entire diaspora paper for this semester. So to begin with, I'll just try to share some slides with you, and as we continue, we will get clarified further. And for today's session, we will only take up block 1, unit 1, 2, and 3. So just have a look on the slides. Just a minute. Just give me a minute. Can you see the slides? Is it visible? Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, if you look at the first slide, this is about understanding diaspora, certain concepts and perspectives. As you know, there are certain, I know some of these concepts like community, nation state, which we would be using again and again while we are taking up these studies on diaspora. I know most of you must be conversant with these topics, but I know that certain students, they do not belong to the discipline of sociology. And that's the reason why I have started with these basic concepts, which I believe we will be discussing again and again as we go through the lectures. The first one is community. It is one of the most simplest concepts that we keep using in disciplines like sociology and anthropology. And if you look at this concept, you will see that it is about a group having certain shared cultures, certain certain norms is being followed among these groups. But one of the most important idea of this concept is the idea of territory that is associated with it. They are always restricted in certain territorial respect. But this idea of community has changed in the post-globalized era.
Tanaya,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
wait. So, I mean, students, I mean, I had disconnected, but no issue. Tanaya, you
Okay.
continue with today's class.
Okay. Sorry. I couldn't actually hear you.
Okay.
Okay. So, am I audible to all the students? I'm not actually getting a feedback, so that's the reason.
Yeah, you're audible. You're very much audible.
Yeah.
Continue.
And you can see the slides. Okay. Hello. So, what I am trying to say that when you are talking about this concept called community, actually it could face certain changes in the post-globalized era, because in the post-globalized era we started doing away with this idea of territory getting severed from this concept. Because today we talk about online community, we talk about WhatsApp group as a community, so where the idea of territory is not associated. So basically we talk here in this paper, we keep talking about diasporic communities. And the other concept that we will be taking up again and again is the idea of nation and nation state. Idea of nation and nation state, they're again different. When you're talking about the nation is a feeling, it's just a sentiment. It's a sentiment that is associated with a particular territorial bounded with a territorial bounded community. Scholars like Benedict Anderson, they have talked about nation as a community, as an imagined community. But when you're talking about the concept of nation state, the idea of state is a centralized authority over a territory. So nation and nation state, when we bring these two concepts together, we actually talk about a sentiment along with a politicized administrative unit. And the other concept that we would be, focusing again and again would be the idea of homeland. Homeland, you see, whenever we talk about diasporic communities, there is one point of origin and a point of destination. The point of destination where they have migrated to is called the host country, whereas the country that left behind, is called the homeland. But this homeland can be a real or it can be a mythical. It can be of mythical origin. For example, in case of the Jews, for generations they might have never visited this. They never had a homeland, but it's an imaginary concept. They believe that is the present day Israel is their homeland. So it can be imaginary and it can be real. And then transnationalism. Transnationalism as a concept, you will see that, when in this present age of globalization, we have our adherence to different territories. My country of origin was different. I was born in India. I migrated to USA country. So, I am in a state of where I'm in a state where I'm witnessing a kind of a transnationalism. I'll go into the details of the concept after few sessions when we'll be dealing with concepts like globalization. So coming to the next concept, that is, we will try to see what this idea of a diaspora is all about. If you see diaspora, it has been described by scholars like Ember and Skogart as a people dispersed by whatever cause in more than one location. The people dispersed to different land, and they may harbor the thoughts of return or may fully assimilate themselves to the host countries. They may maintain relationship with the other communities in the diaspora, or they may have a link with the countries of origin. But basically, these are a group, a community who have dispersed from the place of origin. And if you look at the etymological origin of the term, it originated with the dispersion of Jews among. It is called dispersion of Jews among gentle nations. It is referred to all the Jews who lived outside the biblical land of Israel. So gradually, this term expanded its canvas and it started including people from outside the traditional other communities apart from the Jews. It is also referred to the Greek community, and in Greek the etymological meaning of diaspora is scattering of seeds. And this term has also been mentioned in the Old Testament, which also refers to the Jews. So basically, we cannot actually think of studying this diaspora studies if we don't have a look into the history of Jews and Greeks, because these were the ones who have been migrating ever since time immemorial. Historically, mythologically, the movement of Jews can be traced, and it is from this community that this concept of diaspora has been inspired. And now, if you look at certain features of a diasporic community, Safran has given a 6-point model to enumerate the features. The first one is dispersal from the original homeland. Suppose being an Indian, I am migrating, say, to Africa. So I am dispersing from my original homeland. Then retention of collective memory. What is this collective memory? You will see that after few generations, suppose I was the first generation of migrant to another host country, and after few generations, say my children or my grandchildren who have never visited India, or they have never seen India, but still, it is through certain tales, it is through certain stories that we keep passing on the collective memory. So it is called it's actually an archetypal memory of the entire group that is passed on. So this collective memory lies mostly in imagination, and it is passed on from one generation to another. Then the second is the vision, or the myth of homeland. So I have a longing for the homeland. This homeland could be a real one, it could be a mythical one, but there is always a longing for this homeland when we talk about the diasporic community. Then the idealized wish to return to the original homeland. Then there is a desirable commitment to restore homeland, and continuous renewal or linkages with your homeland. So these are some of the 6-point model that Safran has talked about when we talk about the diasporic community. But it is not necessary that all these 6 points would be available with a diasporic community. There could be a community who really do not want to return to the original homeland anymore, or they don't have any commitment to restore. So it's not necessary that you will find all these points among the diasporic communities. Then, whenever we talk about diaspora, there are certain perspectives for understanding diasporic communities. I try to say that diasporic communities are like any other community that you can see around. You see, for example, you can say that a village can be a community, a caste is a community, a tribal group can be a community, or your kinship, the network of kinship you share, it can be a community, it can form to be a community. A nation can be a community, but the idea of diasporic community is very different. It is different because the ideas, the experiences of different diasporas are so varied, and at the same time with different generations, they tend to, save their imagination, their experience based on the homeland as well as the host country. And if you come to the third or the fourth generation who never had an idea of the homeland, they would be again, trying to reconstruct their mythical idea of homeland through this collective memory. So the idea of a diasporic community has always been a complicated one. And in order to do so, there are different perspectives for looking at diasporic community. We have the retentionist perspective, the adaptionist perspective, the plural society perspective. Then there is this ethnicity approach, the political economic perspective, and I'll be taking up each of this perspective one by one. Sorry. Yeah. Coming to the retentionist perspective. This pertains, the practice of retaining the cultural form which we, picked up from our place of origin. It is something, those traits, those cultural forms, those qualities which we have carried with ourselves to the host country, to the country we started living in. And for generations to come, we tend to retain those practices. We would try to socialize the upcoming generations with the same practices, even if, even if they have never visited India. But I would be, sticking to very strict norms of caste system in terms of marriage or in terms of commensality. So these are certain traits that I would try to retain, even if I have severed my links from my homeland, but I am trying to create a miniature homeland within the host country in a very miniature form. So I tend to retain some of these qualities or some of the traits which I have carried from my place of origin. So in case of India, you will see that they share certain common ethnic cultural forms, and at the same time, they faced racial discrimination in their host countries. When Indians, they have traveled to Western countries, it is, it's always the memories of the place of origin that has been haunting them, and at the same time, there is this othering from the whites who have a kind of a racial discrimination towards the India. And there is a longing for your original community, and at the same time, you are not being completely integrated in your host society. So what happens? You as Indians, you come together. You come together with your shared culture, with your traits, with your practices, and you come together as a community. You try to bind each other with those practices, and you tend to retain it for generations to come. I'll give an example. This was a study that was taken up by Morton Class. Morton Class, he presented a study of Indian diaspora in Trinidad, that is in Caribbean, in 1961. And he could clearly see how ideas of caste, arranged marriage, the kind of lower status we saw to women in India, it was all carried forward in the Trinidadian society. And along with that, there were certain Indian institutionalized practices which were replicated in the host society. It was as if, a miniature India existed in those Trinidadian societies. So that is how, a retentionist perspective is carried out. And you will see that this perspective has been criticized for not taking into consideration the changes that is taking place both in the host and in the nation of their origin. You will see, for example, in you know in the country of origin also, we are undergoing massive change every day. Today, you may not be so much conscious of your caste, or you may not be so much aware of the practices that your parents or your grandparents used to have. And you may, slowly try to gradually let yourself loose of those practices. So there is a gradual change that is taking place in the homeland. And at the same time, with the coming next generation, say the second or third generation, they may not, abide by the strict community rules and regulations. They may set themselves free. They may feel that the second or third generation may not feel that they are Indians who have migrated to Trinidad. They might feel that they are, a citizen of Trinidad. Trinidad is their homeland. So these are certain changes that one undergoes, but the retentionist perspective has not taken them into consideration. And that's one of the major criticisms that is lodged against this perspective. And the next is the adaptationist perspective. This perspective is about adaptability of a diasporic community in the host country. I have migrated from my country of origin. Say, as an Indian, I have migrated to a different country, and I try to assimilate with the norms and cultures of the host country. I try to mingle my identity with them. In this case, there was this study taken up by R.K. Jain, and Jane could actually, he took up the study on South Indian migrants in Malaysia's rubber plantation, and it reflected on the interaction between traditional rural South Indians with how they're coming across with the norms of what you can say a sort of industrial bureaucracy, how they are negotiating their own community rules and regulation with the new kind of a workplace that they have settled, and they are trying to readjust their lives with that. And then there was this study by Burton Benedict's work on Mauritian society. It also gives instances on trends of unification with the host country. How even the idea of unification would not be same. The way you are assimilating with the host country, whatever traits get rid of, and whatever new traits you pick up, there is a pattern developing. So every society will have different patterns of this kind of a development. Uh, that's that was about the adaptationist perspective. The next is about in between identities. Sorry, I'm just. The next was about the plural society perspective, and if you look at this perspective, it one of the major what you can say uh, contribution came from M.G. Smith, who tried to define plural society as a social structure characterized by fundamental discontinuities and cleavages, and a cultural complex based on systematic institutional diversity. So you will see that this perspective was also proposed by Furnival, and Furnival tried to what you can say mention the look at this plural society from three different dimensions. And I'll be taking up this perspective further as well, because it has been discussed in your coming sessions. uh, what Furnival says that there are three dimensions when you look at a plural society. One is the cultural, the economic, and the political. When you talk about cultural dimensions, you will see that when there is an interaction between different cultural sections, some sort of communication is hampered. Either you are not too very palatable in interacting with certain communities, or you want to maintain a distance. So there is an what you say, a severing of communication among these different cultural sections. The second is economical. It's the market relations that decide. So basically, it's about the market relations, and it is what about how the communities they behave as economic beings. And politically, mostly it is seen that the colonial power dominates, and they tend to hold together a plural society. If you see, there are certain literature which says that the idea of India came with the Britishers. Prior to the arrival of the Britishers, we lived as as Marathas, as Utkalas, as Dravidan. The idea of India never existed because it was a plural society. We have so much of plurality in terms of language, in terms of religion, in terms of caste practices, in terms of customs. There is massive plurality. So it was only with the colonial power that we were held together, and the consciousness of being Indian and Indian nationalism came up. But again, this idea has been refuted by few other scholars as well. And there is not one particular way of looking at things or a plural society. Uh, there is this study by R.K. Jain who put forth his criticism against Furnival, and he says that the kind of ideas that Furnival is actually talking about, it holds true for certain settlement societies and not for civilization societies. Settlement societies are the ones which are newer communities that came up after colonialism. Say, for example, Australia. Say, for example, the Fiji society, the Tobago society. These are new settlements. But if you talk about civilizations, ancient civilizations like the Indus Valley civilizations, Indian society is not a new settlement. It is a civilizational settlement. Society. It's not a settlement society. So whenever you are talking about a plural society argument, Jane says that it holds true only for the new kind of colonial settlement societies and not for the ancient civilizations that existed prior to these kind of societies. So this perspective, received criticism during the 1950s and 60s when Cooper, R.T. Smith, they questioned whether these societies under study qualify as societies. Can we say that they are communities, or they are just an aggregate of people who have been, put together under one administrative unit? If you remember in the beginning of the class, I talked to you about concepts like nation and nation state. I'll give you an example which can also be, we can it will help us in understanding this point. Say, during the time of Alexander the Great, Alexander was the one who actually, who during his reign, he could conquer almost the entire Europe, parts of Africa, parts of Asia. So he could bring three different continents under his political administrative unit. We can say that, he was trying to carve out a state out of these three continents, but they cannot come together as a community. We cannot say that it is a nation, because this common sharedness, this commonality, this link, the shared culture never existed. So whenever we are talking about a plural society, can that plural society be can it qualify to be called a society? Can we look at it in terms of a community, or it's just an aggregate of few groups who have come together and it has become difficult to manage these groups? So that was the question mark that Cooper and R.T. Smith were putting on this plural society perspective. Then the next is the ethnicity approach. Ethnicity approach, if you talk about ethnicity, Jayawardene was the one who studied the culture of Fijians and Guyana through the lens of ethnicity, where he proposes that ethnicity emerges from class, status, and power, to which there was few refutation. Some of the scholars didn't agree with. And to go further, I'll just give certain examples that she could bring out during her study. She come up with two different examples of Indian diaspora. In Guyana society, there was a considerable number of Indian diasporic community, and so also in Fijian society. But the thing was that when you are talking about the Guyana society, you will see that Indians had lost all ties with the traditional Indian culture, and they were forced to put forth a mythical ethnic identity and ethnicity as well. Now, there is again a difference between ethnicity and ethnic identity. When I'm talking about ethnicity, it is ethnicity is something which you tend to recognize through, say, your facial features, certain linguistic markers. But ethnic identity are those traits that you have in you, that you tend to project in order to retain a certain identity for yourself. You will see that in the Fijian society, they possessed ethnic identity, but the idea of ethnicity was not there. They were not very distinct as an ethnic group of Indians, but they could maintain an ethnic identity because you will see that Hindi songs are still popular in Fiji, and in Fiji they speak pure Hindi, not the Hindi never got creolized as in most other societies. So, and in Fijian societies they maintained a regular contact with their homelands, which never happened in Guyana. So, even if these are two diasporic communities, which and both of them they had the same place of origin, you will see that there is a over the years they have come up as two different diverse forms of community. They are so very different from each other when they project themselves. And then there was this criticism that was put forth by Drummond, who criticized Jayawardena and said that she shared ethnicity as a secondary status. For her, the markers like class, status, power were more important than ethnicity. And she believed that ethnicity is just something that has emerged out of it. And he talked about the emergence of Creole languages in certain cultures where there are multi-ethnic society. So you will see that say I will talk about this language of Hindi, the way it is spoken among a group in say the Caribbeans. They have certain songs where you have certain Hindi words which is intermixed with their own vernacular language, and a strange Creole Hindi language emerges. But you will not see the same thing in Fiji. The pure Hindi language was retained there. It was not creolized. So even if you will see these diasporic communities coming from the same place, but still the patterns, the cultural forms they take, it is indeed diverse. Then the next perspective is about the political economy perspective. John Drake suggests that there is a continuity between the 19th century and 20th century immigration of Indians to industrially developed nations. And it was mostly, it was the movement of labor. It was, if you can relate it to, the center periphery theory where labor forces were, taken from these countries because it was labor used to be very cheap, and these societies used to be either plantation societies where they needed manpower, immense manpower, or industrial societies. So here you will see that racism has always been a barrier to free labor movement from the underdeveloped to the advanced economies. And though laborers from the metropolitan and the underdeveloped economies, they share the same class, but their status would be different. Status is something which is associated with honor, and class is an economic indicator. I maybe, both of us may be having the same kind of economic power. We might be earning the same salary, but there is a difference in the kind of prestige one accords in a society. So class could be an economic indicator, caste system could be an example of status. So similarly, it was seen that the laborers who migrated from India, and when they were compared to the laborers of the host countries, even if class wise they would be same, status wise they would be different. And Beckford makes a mention of this indentured labor in plantation areas, which led to continuity of socio-economic and cultural systems. So you have certain indentured labor in these plantation areas. I'll be talking about indentured labor in the next sessions, and the plantation areas could be the countries like Malaysia where there was rubber plantation, or the Caribbean countries where sugar cane was in great demand. So these were the plantation sites, and for these sites, laborers were carried away mostly from Indian people of Indian origin were taken to these places. Now the famous work of Frank Wallerstein, Undergunda Frank Wallerstein, or they talk about this core periphery model of development of capitalism, and they believe that the Indian labor force there appeared as a disprivileged section, but it was just an economic policy, an economic need that made these traverses of these labor forces all through. Then, we will be talking about certain in-between identities. What is this in-between identity? If you look at the diaspora community, you will see that there are multiples of identities. It's today the communities who moved away from their place of origin and they have relocated themselves in different other host countries. They have multiple identities. They may not, they are a citizen of India and at the same time they could be a citizen of USA. They are, they might call themselves Indian, they might call themselves, you know Americans within Americans of Indian origin. And you will see that they may be citizens to their host countries, to their country of origin, or they are consciously trying to make a connectivity with the ethnic community to where they belong to, or in the host countries where they can find people who belong to the same ethnic community. And there are people who are caught between different nation states. There are idea of multiple citizenships. There is this entire networking system that is coming up today. For example, when I say that today it's an age of globalization where this is a cosmopolitan identity. Normally, we tend to say that during this stage of globalization, there is this concept of deterritorialization. And what is this deterritorialization? We say that in the context of globalization, nation states are losing its relevance. The national boundaries are getting porous. Metaphorically, these words are used. The reason being that territory doesn't actually matter, because today you are at one place, you may fly away to another place, or you see here when we are trying to have this online lectures, you people are located at different, what you say, different territories, but still we stay connected. And this is the IGNOU class for MSO classes. So the reason is there is this idea of deterritorialization taking place. We tend to stay connected, and at the same time the idea of territory doesn't, it may not be that relevant as it used to be in the previous generation. And that's the reason why it is said that nation states, as a community, as an entity, are losing its essence, because today we are talking about cosmopolitan identity. I don't say that I'm an Indian. I'm an Indian, at the same time I'm an American. So there are multiple citizenships coming up. There are multiple adherences to nation states. So there is this, idea of unfixity. There is not a fixed identity that I am only an Indian and nothing else. There is this cosmopolitan, multifarious identity that has come up with, that we have come up with, and this has given up, given this idea of deterritorialization and at the same time reterritorialization among the diasporic communities. You may get deterritorialized, you may relocate yourself, you may, find new communities, new localities. So there is an immense expansion over space if you're talking about these communities. Can I just ask you whether you have any doubts? Anybody? Or shall I continue further? Hello? Someone come up with some response, because I'm not finding any response
Ma'am,
from any.
please continue, ma'am. I have
Okay,
no
any
doubt.
doubt? Any further clarification on anything? No?
No, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So these are these in-between identities that we have been discussing till now. Now, the next is, sorry, just a minute. Just a second. Yeah. We will take up the discussion further, and we will be talking about the Indian diaspora, the uniqueness of the Indian diaspora. You know, whenever we talk about Indians, it is mostly referred to as, as if we Indians have migrating genes in us. We can relocate ourselves and comfortably. You will try to adjust to any situations anywhere in the globe. And today, if you travel anywhere around the globe, you will find Indians everywhere. So Indian diaspora has a different history. They have a different, what you can say, uh, set of experience of being a diasporic community. And when you look at this entire waves of Indian diasporic movement, you will see that it can be divided into three phases. The first phase was the ancient and the medieval monarchs and the traders who established contacts with the Middle East, the Eastern or the Northern Africans and the South Asians. They were, it was just a trading relationship. It was because of trading relationships that the ancient uh, during the ancient and the medieval times, monarchs and nobles used to travel to other parts of the globe for fostering trade relationships. For example, if you in the context of Odisha, if we say the Sandhoko, we have we had trading relationships with Bali and Sumatra. So it was popularly referred to as a historical imaginary entity of the Greater India. And you will find this greater, the expansion of India, the Greater India being found in else part of the world. The second phase was because of colonialism. It was, and again it has its relation to the what do you say, the massive industrial revolution that was taking place in Europe, which created a demand for not only resources but at the same time labor. So mostly it was emigration to these construction sites, sorry, the plantation sites or the industrial sites where Indians were forced to move to these colonies of the British, the French, or Dutch. The stories are strange. You have many heart-wrenching, sad stories associated with this diasporic community, which we will be taking up in the next classes. And that creates a major chunk of diaspora community actually. And the third phase of diaspora that you see in the contemporary times where people tend to travel to the industrially developed west or the oil rich nations, and it is for because of economic prosperity. It is a matter of choice. And you know during phase 2 there was this idea of choice was very minimal. In most of the time it was a case of forced migration, or people during those times, they were completely illiterate and ignorant. They never had any sense of geography, because as you move further you will see that how they were being cheated to move into places which they never knew, or they never knew that they would never return to their homelands. They never knew that Caribbeans existed in the east or west. They would be believing, made to believe that okay, the Caribbean islands or Malaysia is maybe a village next door, or you will arrive that in few hours. And the moment they would reach there after so many months of struggle, they would realize that they are here never to return. So the phase 2 was a painful affair, but phase 3 is different. So if you look at these three different phases of diaspora, you will see that every phase has actually created its own space of own sphere of diasporic communities, and the integration process has also been different for all these three different phases. Then next is how do you look at the approaches for studying Indian diaspora? You will see that some of the we have already talked about the approaches in terms of the retentionist perspective, the adaptionist perspective. You will find replications of the same, because we are trying to look at the movement of people, how they settle in a new society, what kind of cultural forms they continue to have within the framework of these perspectives. And if you look at the Indian society, you will see that one of the the latest is the perspective that we have adopted in the liberalized era. There is liberalization, there is globalization and privatization, and there is immense flow of capital. There is this, you have scholars like Arjun Appadurai who talks about different scapes. He talks about movement of people, of media images, of finance, of technology, and of ideas in this age of globalization. So he calls them scapes. Media scapes, ethnoscapes means people, finance scapes means finances, then ideascapes means your ideas. So today, when we are talking about migration, it is a case of opportunity for us. It is not a case of being a bonded laborer that we mock at as Odias, acha, dadana sramiko. We use this term. It is not the case today. Today, it's a huge opportunity. And if you remember, during the 70s and 80s, this concept of brain drain was very popular, and Indians were very worried about it, that there is this case of brain drain. We have scientists, we have IIT engineers who use the resources of this country, and they move out of the country, they get settled in US because they receive a huge package there. So there is a case of brain drain. Our brain is getting drained because there is a lack of opportunity in our own country. But today, this brain drain concept is a pre-globalization concept. We do not use this. We call it brain banks rather than brain drain. That is the perspective that we have in the liberalized age. Then there is this literary perspective. Literary perspective, here you will see that it imagines the complexity of being an Indian in the context of a diaspora. The construction of Indian identity differs across the globe, and there are so many literatures. You might have heard of V.S. Naipaul. I mean, who is actually a part of the diasporic community. His forefathers were you know, were one of those plantation laborers who had migrated from India to the Caribbeans, and you know, being a third or fourth generation, how this idea of growing up in a different country where you are different from the rest of the members of your host nation, and at the same time there is a connectivity. You have never been to your homeland. You don't know, you have a chance of visiting it again or not, but there is an imaginary world that lies there, and it has actually created this diasporic community, has created immense literature. Or it is either the diasporic community or it is on the diasporic community that today you have come up with. And today, look at most of the Hollywood films, sorry, the Bollywood films, most of the Hindi films are about these diasporic communities. People settled abroad in London, in America, how these middle class Indians they behave, how a new kind of a culture is growing, what are their anxieties. So the entire focus has shifted. If you make a comparison between the movies of the say the 60s and 70s and today's, there is a shift. We don't talk about you know if you look at the movies of the 70s, the opening scene would be a green field with water running down the dam that talked about India's modernity. Today, we talk about the post globalized, the postmodern phenomena that that is about the West, about this relocated Indians in the West. So, that is about this literary perspective. Then there is again this demographer's perspective, who actually keeps an account of the population, the fertility rate, the language that is spoken across the world, what kind of language it is spoken. I mean, what is the prosperity level of Indians across the globe? I mean, are Indians rich or poor in America, in Australia, in the Africas? What kind of occupations they take up? So, it's a it interests the demographers in a different way. When you are relocated from your homeland and how well you are doing there. When some of them had moved because of economic opportunities, how they are doing there. What is their entire, in terms of demography, we try to press the diasporic community. Then there are geographers who have actually divided Indian immigrants in 6 zones, namely Africa and Mauritius, West and South Asia, the Pacific, the Caribbeans, the North America, and Europe. These are the, what you say, the major belts where you will have diasporic community existing because of, again, thanks to colonialism, it's a boon or a bane, we don't know, but a new kind of culture has emerged because of that. So there are these 6 zones where you will mostly find Indian communities. Then there is an anthropological understanding that refers to migration of Indians to these distant lands, and it is termed by Anderson as long distance nationalism. Because when you talk about nationalism, it is the surge of a feeling, the feeling of being connected with a nation. When there is a India-Pakistan match, there is a surge of feeling of nationalism in you. So when you are located somewhere else, say you are in Africa and you are again watching the match, you are in a distant place, you may not have the citizenship of India anymore, but still you have this idea that you are a person of Indian generation, Indian origin. Now you are the fourth or fifth generation of India, and you might support India when the match is going on. So there is this long distance nationalism that is being practiced whenever we talk about in an anthropological sense, whenever we talk about this diasporic community. Then again, coming back to the perspectives, it's mostly the same perspective that we have already discussed, be it the retentionist or the adaptivist. The name could be slightly different, and I have actually tried to retain the terminologies and mostly the material that is given in your textbook. I have not taken it elsewhere unless to clarify certain things where I can make things more clear. The reason being that I want you to go through the slides and then go through the textbook so that will give you a clear idea of what we have been discussing right now. So whenever we are talking about, when now we are talking about perspectives, we will see that cultural persistence. It is nothing but a kind of a form of retentionist perspective. And here it is the case of in your book they have again cited the study of Morton Glass, who is actually focusing on the continuity of cultural practices that these East Indians who had traveled to Trinidad, they have retained as an Indian community in those localities. They still retain the caste practices, they still retain the arranged marriage practices. When the entire world around them, the environment around them is completely different, they believe that it is through these practices that they can maintain their identity of being Indian or being a community who are different from the Trinidadians. So this is again a cultural persistence. They try to, retain their cultural forms and continue with us in every slight way in which they can. Then the next is the socio-cultural adaptation. And here we have again taken the same study. I think it was about the Tamilians who had migrated to Malaysia to work in the rubber plantation industries, and it was about how they negotiated between the work culture there and the community lifestyles that they were used to in India. They believe that okay, the work culture is such that I may not retain my caste practices. I may have to eat out with people who belong to different caste groups, which I may not have which I might not have practiced when I was in India, but I was ready to set off those practices. I was ready to adapt new norms within the Malaysian society, and I have actually assimilated my identity with that of a Malaysian. So now the fourth or fifth generation of Tamilians who are now citizens of Malaysia, they might have certain, okay, my forefathers belong to India, but neither we speak Tamil nor any Indian language. But yes, we know that there is a slight link between that country of origin. So this is an assimilationist behavior. So they are trying to adapt to the new culture. It's not that they have completely thrown away each and every part of their culture, but whenever needed, they have tried to mold it in a new way. Then the next is the urban ethnicity approach, where it's basically the Gujaratis or the Patidars in London. You will see that they have worked around certain international kins and friendship networks to avail economic opportunities. For example, if you look into the case of Marwadis in India, there has been many studies on this community, that they are rich and prosperous. This community, you will hardly find a poor Marwadi. The reason being that this community, this is one such community which actually works on its traditional kinship relations. They try to draw their social networking to be used for their economic advancement. Suppose for trading, a Marwadi might a person from the Marwadi community have to travel to some other state. He would be again trying to find contacts of another Marwadi, from the same community, and he would take his help. And when needed, he would try to reciprocate the same way. So similarly, here you will find certain kind of international kinship group or a friendship being developing, a new kind of networking emerging, which is actually helping each other in grasping this economic opportunity. So that's about urban ethnicity. It's again a new kind of perspective as to how networking takes place among this diasporic community. Because when you are a diaspora, there is this feeling of being left out. You are you are different from the rest of the natives of your host environment. They might discriminate against you. So here it becomes very important that I have my own community rules. I have my bonding very strong, so that I'll not be left out. I'll be able to avail all economic opportunities. I'll be socially healthy, and I'll maintain a life of prosperity even when I am not located in my homeland. I'm so far away from my own people. So I will try to create my own people in this distant land. So that is about urban ethnicity. Then you have this argument, as I told you earlier, the civilizational versus settlement societies. I told you that whenever we talk about civilizational societies, civilizational societies are associated with the great civilizations. Say the Romans, the Indians, you know, the Egyptians. So they are societies with which you might say that in case of Indus Valley civilization, the Aryans migrated to India. Why don't you call them diaspora? It's an entire civilization that has transformed the Indian society forever. So we tend to call them civilizational societies. And settlement societies are relatively newer ones. And in most cases, settlement societies have been a product of colonialism or some external force. It is because of certain external force that you have. Take, for example, war. Say, when Bangladeshi refugees came to India in the 70s. Or take, for example, the Tibetan refugees. When they were being attacked by China, they tried to, you know, find help from India. So, it is an external force that makes these settlements. So they can be also called as diasporic communities. And how do they negotiate with their former identity and the present identity? So there are few characteristics of these settlement societies. They have a relatively short history. Then they are among the presence of native population, and they are trying to negotiate or assert their identity, or they might be facing identity crisis. There is a lot of literature and debate on this issue of identity whenever we talk about this diasporic community, because that is one major issue for them. And there is an external force. It could be colonialism, it could be any form of imperialism, mostly in terms of war or any kind of imperialistic force that makes them, avail this new kind of a settlement. Then you will see that there is always a correlationship between economy and ethnic relation. Take for example, the chameleons in Malaysia, or the Indians who were working in the sugarcane plantations in Trinidad, or say the Fijians. There is a certain kind of relationship between economy and the ethnic identity. You see that, oh, these are the Indians. They were the ones who came as laborers to work here. So, you are able to establish a relationship between the kind of work they do and the kind of ethnic relationship they maintain with the natives and with their own diasporic community. Then these settlement societies are also geopolitical entities. Here I'll give you an example. You will see that Mexico and Latin America, they represent certain civilizational society, whereas Caribbeans are settlement societies. And they are geopolitical entities because they were the landmarks. This is the place which is important economic hub. So these are the people who actually run the economy. So these settlements have emerged as important geopolitical, what do you say, landmark entities. And then you will see that whenever you can talk of a certain non-modern civilizational society in Europe or India, they share a kind of a dialectical relationship with the settlement societies, and there is a mutual interaction. Non-modern because these civilizational societies were created when modernity had not yet arrived. Whenever we talk about modernity, we normally relate it that, okay, in the West, in the European society, it was because of these three revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Enlightenment, that modernity came. So we are talking about such a society which had established itself prior to this Industrial Revolution, prior to the Renaissance, prior to the French Revolution. So that's the reason we call it a non-modern civilizational society. Or take, for example, the case of Indian modernity. We always associate India's modernity with encounter with colonialism. So whenever we talk about the invasion of the Aryans, we always say that it's a kind of a non-modern civilizational society, and we tend to share a direct relationship with the settlement societies. Now that as Indians they were settled here, and then you move on to a different country, you have different settlement societies where you could move out. So you tend to maintain a new kind of an interaction here. Then there was this scholar Thorsten who gave certain contrasting example of South Africa. And if you know, South Africa it's a multicultural society, and again it's a result of colonial settlement. There you will see there is a struggle between the blacks and the whites. The Europeans who settled themselves in Africa as administrators or as traders, and there you will see that there is contesting for indigenous versus settler status as to who is indigenous and who is settler. There is always a struggle between the blacks and the whites. But if you look at the status of Indians in South Africa, they are quite happy with the settler status. They have claimed that, and they don't have any more contentions to make. So, they are like segregated as different, and they are not a part of this struggle that takes place between the blacks and the whites in this kind of a multicultural society. So that's a new pattern emerging there in a multicultural society like South Africa. Then we can also look at civilizational societies from within the framework of social evolutionism. Thus, islands like Fiji, Tobago, Trinidad, they were found to be more elementary than civilizational societies. They're elementary because they were settlement societies. And since civilizational societies are ancient and they have been there for quite a long time, you will see more complex structures emerging there. That's not seen in these new kind of settlement societies because they are relatively new. So the kind of social, the structural formations, the cultural formations they would be having, it will be less complicated than the civilizational society. And similarly, the patterns within Indian society emerging witnesses interaction between great tradition and little tradition, giving rise to syncretic cultural forms. Take for example in India the case of Hindus and Muslims. There would be a syncretic tradition between that where there is interaction between these two communities. Take for example the Sikh community. The Sikh community, as pointed out by Indian scholars, they believe that it has emerged because of certain syncretic traditions between Islam and Hinduism. But at the same time, you will see that there is a hegemonic dominance of the great tradition to some extent. The dominating community will actually have a influence as to how the community, what you say, identity pattern would be getting shaped up. Okay. Uh, Okay, there is this table that was there in your material, and I will try to help you understand what it means. If you here you can see that we are actually talking about three. You can see three different columns. One is talking about societal correlate, where we are talking about certain societal elements that is shaping a community. We are trying to identify what kind of historically we are trying to identify the elements here. Then here we are talking about new settlement, the patterns that is found in new settlement and the pattern that is found in civilizational society. Say when we talk about the historical conjecture, we are trying to see that what historical conjecture means. At what historical point of time did the new settlement emerge and the civilizational societies emerge? You will see that civilizational societies emerged, mostly we have already discussed that it was a pre-modern society. So normally in Western society, we associate modernity with the three revolutions. And capitalism again, is a product of modernity. So in civilizational society, you will find some earlier vestiges of capitalism. But in the newer settlement societies, it is a kind of late capitalism that you will find, because it is these new settlements are a product of either colonialism or in the globalized era when we are traveling across the globe for enjoying economic benefits. So that's the reason it's a product of late capitalism. Then if you talk about evolutionary, we will try to trace its path. You will see that, so they could be they could be looked at from certain models of development, both the new settlement and the civilizational settlement. And as I told you earlier, I have mentioned earlier that you will find more complex structures in the civilizational society than in the new settlement societies. Then if you look at the intellectual orientations that would be used to understand this new settlement and the civilizational society, you will see that the intellectual orientation that we use for understanding civilizational society is modernity. Because, the idea is a bit complicated because, I'm afraid I might be digressing from the topic, but it is important here to make a mention of modernism because modernism gives you an idea of fixity. When you say that you belong to a civilizational society like India, and I ask you, who are you? And you would see that, you can easily say that I'm an Indian. There is a fixed identity that you are an Indian. But now I'm talking about this new settlement. And say, for example, a person who was an Indian citizen till 1947, and with the creation of Pakistan after partition became a Pakistani citizen, and then with the creation of Bangladesh in 1971 became a Bangladeshi citizen. So when you talk about his identity, it's an idea of fragmentation. It's not fixed. It kept changing. I was under the belief that we are born with a national identity and we die with it. But that may not be possible. And today, this idea of fragmentation has become even more, what you say, aggravated in the post-globalized era. I might be having a Indian passport and a US passport. I might be having an Indian passport, but I might have migrated from India and I might have settled in the US. Now I have both the citizenship. So when you talk about my identity, it is not fixed. It is fragmented. I plan to move to the Australia in coming few years. So I'm here talking about a cosmopolitan identity. So this kind of fragmentation is actually a trait in postmodernism. Uh, then, when you talk about deterritorialization and multiple territorialization, deterritorialization, as I told you, you're moving away from certain territory because with national identity, territory has always been important. It's always a territory that associates with any kind of a nationalist identity. But with this new settlement, I am drifting away from the original settlement. And today, we can talk about multiple territorialization. Maybe a country can actually, in terms of territory, it is expanding itself. It is going on to new areas. And when you talk about this new settlement, it can be a new age religion that we are following. Talk, for example, the context of Indians in this generation. We talk about liberalization and consumption as the ideology. The ideology was different in the pre-liberalized era. Say, for example, the Gandhian and the the Nehruvian economy. It is also often called the thrift economy. If you look at the ads of the advertisements of those times, prior to the 80s, 90s, you will see that the focus was on saving. Today, the focus is on consumption. The more you can consume, the more you can, it is liberating. The idea of consumption is liberating. So these are the new currents. That this new settlement society and the civilizational society is facing. Then coming to certain diasporic communities, you will see that Cohen has identified 6 forms of diasporic community. So whenever, how do we look at diasporic community today? Today, I would say that, okay, somebody is settled in USA or somebody is settled in the Europe. It's okay, somebody is settled in USA or Europe. That means, they might be quite prosperous. So how do you relate to the diasporic community? The kind of image it produces. But, you know, during the early 19th century, during the colonial period, whenever we talked about diasporic community, it was about pain, it was about suffering. Today it is about celebration. Today diasporic community is about, economic opportunities. But the idea was not that in those days. So that's the reason, Cohen has identified 6 different diasporic communities, and these diasporic communities have appeared at different historical junctures, but they have certain identities associated with themselves of being a diaspora. And every diasporic community has its own history, has their own experience, has their own share of happiness and sufferings, and that is what makes them, what you say, distinct and separate from the rest of the communities. Say, for example, when you talk about Jews and African Americans, take for example the Africans. You know, Africans were literally kidnapped from their villages to be made slaves. You know, they might not be knowing that they have been sold out in some distant country whose name they have never heard in their lives. Take, for example, the Jews as a community. You know, there is some mythical idea about the Jews being responsible for the death of Jesus Christ, and that has always made them the villain for every community. And since Christianity was always the most what you say important religion globally, and it had a global follower, it had followers globally. Jews have always been attacked on various grounds, and if you look at the entire Holocaust experience where Jews were, you know, exterminated, they were killed by the Germans during Hitler's time. So if you talk about this African community or the Jews, you know, what comes before your eyes is victimhood. Because of, when you talk about African Americans, they have come up as slaves. So this is, you know, this is a form of the diasporic community that is always associated with victimhood. They have always been the victims, and you know, at some point of time, they had this feeling that, you know, it's a curse to be born as a Jew, because this entire world is having their wrath against them for no fault of their own, because of some mythical story that existed or that has been circulated across the globe. The next form is a form of labor that you will see is that of Indians. You know, the experience of being an Indian in the colonial times and in this globalized era, they are completely different. You know, I'm talking about an age where when colonialism had arrived, that is 19th century, and what you say that most, you know, almost 95% of Indians were illiterate. They never had a Western education, and it was a time when our society was experiencing a massive structural change. Structural change, I'll give you an example of structural change. Many of you might be knowing, it's a simple term that we use in sociology and anthropology. But since I believe there are students from other disciplines, we use these two terms, structural change and cultural change. Structural change is a change that takes place at the level of institutions. Say, for example, in India, using what you say, natural resources like making of salt from the sea. It was quite common. You know, every Indian, we never bought salt, especially people from the coastal region. You know, you just take a pot of water from the oceans and boil it. What you procure is salt. But with the arrival of the Britishers, they put a ban on collecting water from the ocean. You know, the ocean has it's fathomless. It has unending water, but still they believe that it is the property of the state. The government owns it, and you cannot take. That was a structural change. The policy that you cannot make salt, and that's the reason Gandhi ji, you know, started his struggle with Dandi March, that was, breaking the salt laws. It was important because he believed it was infringement of rights. It was a major structural change for Indians. Or take, for example, denial of forest rights. Tribal people who have always taken the help of forest products, they were denied rights. So there were certain structural changes that was taking place, in the Indian society. And as I told you, since the Industrial Revolution had taken place in the West, and it was one of the reasons why during colonialism they were, they needed resources globally. They were collecting resources so that industries can run in the industrial belts of Manchester and in London. The Indian cottage industries underwent a process of deindustrialization. Now that say I'm a carpenter and I'm not able to make any product because I cannot collect woods from the forest, because now the forest belongs to, it doesn't belong to the community, to the villagers, to the village people, but it belongs to the state. So I don't have any work. What else I would do? I would work as wage laborers, and I would get some opportunity in some distant land that, okay, you will be taken there, say for a year or 6 months, and I'll have to, put my thumb mark on the paper that I'll be back after this many days. But, once I'm there, my entire life collapses. The way Indians were being carried from here to, say to the Caribbeans, to the West Indies. The first thing that gets shattered is, taking up such a long voyage, say 6 months or 8 months to reach. And in the process, when somebody dies, the body has to be thrown into the ocean. I'm doing away with all my ritual, my customary practices. And slowly I do away with my caste practices. I start dining with others. I take whatever is available. I cannot say no, these are the practices that I have to practice. These things gets bombarded completely. So, and once I reach there, I realize that I'm being told that I cannot go home before 5 years. If I try to make a move or if I don't cooperate, I'll be put behind the bars. And after completion of those 5 year terms, they make my return such a difficult task that I find it much easier to settle back or to accept death. That is the kind of, the situation of an Indian laborer. So when you talk about Indians during the colonial period, it is about this idea of being a laborer, the pain and suffering of being an indentured laborer, the bonded laborer. I want to go home, but I cannot because I have been sold out without my knowledge. I don't have a way out. So you have a victim, you have the labor, and both of these are sufferers. Then you have imperial rulers who have traversed across the world because the state has formed colonies. So it's either the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, because these were some of the important imperial powers who have traveled all across the globe in forming colonies, and they traveled as administrators, as rulers, as officers, as a part of the entire administrative unit, as soldiers. So this is how the as a, it's a prestigious thing that you are part of the imperial ruler pottery. So in that category, you have the Britishers, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, whatever. Then you have the Chinese as traders, and if you look at the Chinese, you will see that they have traveled prior to the modern times as traders. They always had these trading genes. And today, with the present pandemic situation around, you can realize that, it's one of the most important, economies, and you will have Chinese everywhere and Chinese products everywhere. The reason being that they had laid that path, they had paved their ways of being a trader, of being a manufacturer since time immemorial. There are historical records of Chinese being traders. And then, for the sake of culture, you have travelers from Caribbean who, music groups, who musicians who have traveled across the world, and mostly you will find Caribbeans in this category. And then you have so this was the category of diasporic community that was given to us by Cohen. And then Safer has distinguished among few categories of diasporic communities. First is the historical diaspora. Here you will find the Jews and the Greeks who immersed in antiquity. We never, we the line between history and myth has been blurred. Mythology has been blurred here. Jews have been traveling, has been migrating since time immemorial because they have always been the perpetual victims. And in order to escape that idea of victimhood, they have traveled. They have always traveled. And so here you will see that the Jews and the Greeks who immersed in antiquity, and now they have become linked to nation states that were created much later. Because it was if you look at the Jews community, you will see that we'll be discussing the history later on in the next few slides. But you will see that the idea of a homeland never existed actually. It was just an imaginary thing. And when they were being, they were being prosecuted everywhere. Whether in Germany, they were being prosecuted, they were being, made an outcast. And when this entire idea of Christianity looks at the Jews as an other, and slowly, they were found dispersed across the globe, and they started having this networking among themselves, and mythologically they could relate their origin to Jerusalem, which is the present day Israel. It never existed. The state was created, the nation state was created much later, but that community always existed, and they were in search of a mythical homeland that never existed for them. So that is about the Jews. They are the historical diasporic community who always had this, this diasporic genes in them. Then the next is the modern diaspora. The modern diaspora were the Italians, the Africans who had a full-fledged state and links, and were established after the 17th century, say during the colonial times. And they had this idea that I belong to this country, I belong to this nation state, and I am a diasporic community here. So they are conscious of their identity. They can make a connection with their homeland, with their country of origin, and at the same time they can continue with their networking. Then the incipient diaspora, those diasporas which remained quite dormant, they were not very visible. You will look at them in terms of the Portuguese, the Pakistanis, who actually, they were actually a minority in most of the societies. They never raised their voice, but it took them some time to organize themselves, both in the host country and at the same time in their homeland. That they exist, they have to make themselves audible to the people back at their homelands as well. So, they had to create this networking for both ways, for their host countries and for their homelands as well. So, they are called the incipient diaspora. So, historically, Safer is talking about three distinct forms of diaspora. Now, we will take up, there are immense studies on, especially on Jewish diaspora, the Chinese diaspora, and the African diaspora, because these are some of the historical diaspora, and they have always traveled, they have always, they have always migrated, and their stories of migration has, the reasons for being of migration has been different in different societies, and they have simply dispersed themselves everywhere. And if you look at the etymological origin of this term diaspora, it was actually referred to the Jews who lived outside Palestine or present day modern Israel. So, diaspora literally means the scattered communities of Jews, and they are the archetypal diasporic community. They are, you know, if you talk about diaspora, the first thing that should come to your mind is the Jews, because they are not only a diasporic community, but they have defined, they have gave this terminology of diaspora to the world. It is through Jews that we draw this concept. This concept has been given to us by them. So, historically we trace that it was during 720 BC that they exiled from the Assyrian Empire, and in medieval times, that situation was much more aggravated because Christianity had already made its presence felt. And as I told you, Christianity has always treated the Jews as the what you say, as the villains, as the, as the culprits, because they were responsible for the death of Jesus. And that's the reason in medieval times the Jews were being persecuted everywhere, and they had to escape from time to time from wherever, whatever societies they were located at. The Roman Empire then imposed strict restrictions on their entry, and it was too unfair. The world has been too unfair to them in every way, and at all times. So here, all kinds of restrictions were put on the Jewish community. Then during the Enlightenment, when we were trying to open up in terms of what is enlightenment. Basically, enlightenment was that phase, because it's a kind of an intellectual revolution. We were trying to question our own the convictions that we grew up with. We started questioning every existing structure and cultural forms that appeared obvious to us. And you know uh, the reason behind enlightenment was two revolutions, that is the scientific revolution and the commercial revolution. And by this time, science had already provided us with the fact that as human beings our anatomy are same, and we all share same structures. Our blood groups can be only divided into 4 or 5 categories. Even if you are a black or a white, you will have the same anatomy, you will have the same organs. So it was slowly spreading this idea of equality. And the same thing, so the idea of equality, the idea of liberty, the idea of freedom was slowly being propagated. So the othering, the kind of othering or the hatred, or the kind of discomfort we had for another community, it was slowly being addressed during the period of enlightenment. So there has always been binary opposites, the communities of believers and non-believers. So the kind of hatred a white man would have for the black, feeling that, okay, the racist feeling of being inferior, that was being questioned. When you believe that Brahmins being superior than the Sudra, that was being questioned. So enlightenment was, trying to question every obvious existing truth that existed for us. And slowly, it actually gave a new lease of life to the Jewish community. And coterminous with the Enlightenment, there was this Haskalah movement. This was, it coincided with again with the revolutions, that was the French revolutions, the revolution that was taking place for equal rights globally, mostly in European society. And as I told you, the new lease of life that the Jewish community received was again uh, a product of modernity, because it was with modernity that we were opening up. Now we started feeling that okay, they are also human beings like us. Who knows, if a single Jew had killed Jesus, should the entire community be punished for that? Or who knows whether Jesus was killed or not killed, or killed by a Jew? So it is based on a myth that we are banishing and punishing an entire community. So these kind of new ideas were actually, dawning upon us during this phase of enlightenment. And you will see that the situation aggravated during Nazi occupation of Germany. It was during Hitler's time till 1945, when Jews were, persecuted. That it was a state-sponsored genocide, and the Jews were actually being targeted. They were picked up from their homes, and there were these concentration camps where they were being exterminated. And that led to the escape of Jews from Germany to other parts of the country globally. And they escaped to USA, South America, and they were dispersed everywhere globally. So Albert Einstein, the great scientist, was a Jew who actually, escaped to the USA during the Nazis' time. So there have been many great minds among the Jew community. And after the Holocaust, it was seen that the Zionist movement among the diaspora was responsible. They started, globally they started networking each other. They believed that, they have been victimized for ages for no fault of their own, and they started networking, and the Jews as a community started having this consciousness. And that actually led to the creation of this mythical idea of a homeland they had in their imagination, that was the state of Israel. So statehood was attained much later, but this consciousness was there much earlier. So normally, what Professor T.K. Woman would say, that it was a nation without a state. Nation is always, I told you in the first part of my lecture, that nation is just a sentiment of being together, being together as a community, the sentiment of, say, being an Indian. It's a sentiment. It has nothing to do with your political, administrative boundaries, or with your rights, or with your idea of citizenship. So the Jews as a nation always existed, because this community, in terms of a diasporic community globally, they could identify themselves with. So the nation was there, but the state was not there. So that was a nation without a state. There can be a state without a nation. There can be a state with many nations. So these are some of these concepts that we have to keep in mind whenever we are talking about diasporic studies. And we'll tend to take up more such concepts as we proceed further with our course. Okay, now coming to the next important major diaspora, that is the Chinese diaspora. You will see that the Chinese, they form one of the largest diaspora in the world, and believe me, you will find them everywhere in the world. And they are different from the Jews. Their history is different. They were never the victims, of mythology, or they were not the ones who were trying to escape their situation. Because the major reason for Jewish diaspora or migration of Jews has been victimhood, where they have been trying to avoid persecution, avoid genocide. They have migrated for that reasons. But the case of Chinese were different. They were always connected to the nation state of People's Republic of China, which had an ancient origin, but their connection was a bit indirect. Again, there is a difference between these Jews and Chinese diaspora. We will see how. You will see in the past, overseas Chinese, if you talk about the Chinese who were migrating, they were called the Han's Chinese. And they were the one who were sent by the Ming dynasty for trade. But mostly they never returned to their place of origin. And that's the reason, you have these pockets of Chinatown everywhere in most in majority part of the globe. In India also, in Calcutta also, you have these Chinatowns. So you will find them everywhere. So these are the communities who never returned. And by 14th and 15th century, there were these Chinese settlement which was seen in Java, Sumatra, Thailand, Singapore, and Philippines. So these were the ones who actually migrated for trading purposes. And during 17th century, the demand for labor in the Western countries, it was because of certain, certain industries, industrial purpose, that the Chinese were again seen migrating to the Western countries because they could actually provide a good chunk of the labor force. But they have there was a, always there has been a racial discrimination against the Chinese, and because of this racial discrimination, a legislation came in 1880s where Chinese were denied entry into America, Australia, Canada until the Second World War. And after the war, the Chinese migration was mostly internal to colonies of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and also to countries like Malaysia and Indonesia. So after the Second World War, the trend of Chinese migration was changing. Initially they were denied entry, they were not allowed to enter. Then they started going to nearby places where they can continue with their trading relations. And it was only during the 70s, 60s and 70s that USA, Canada, they started opening up their doors to Chinese, and there was a change in legislation. But this time the kind of skills they were the demand was not for manual labor, it was for skilled educated people who, you know the very trend of migration was different during the 70s this time. It was not like the previous generation of Chinese who joined the labor force. So it was actually a great mind that was required in the West. It was certain skills, certain set of knowledge that was being sought after, and that's the reason you will find Chinese migrating everywhere. And there was a huge demand in these countries for Chinese immigrants. Then if you look at as I told you, for example, say try to take a look at Chinese diaspora. They will have different stories and different patterns of community developing in every part of the world. So if you say the case of Chinese in USA would be different from the case of Chinese in Thailand, and they would be different from that in Taiwan. They would be different from that in Myanmar. Say in Chinese, the Chinese in Thailand, they intermarried with the natives and completely assimilated their identity, everything mingled with the Thailand people, the Thai people. So they did not keep themselves as distinct ethnic groups. But in case of Myanmar, you know certain strict policies were written where Chinese were not allowed to marry the local. The case of Chinese diaspora community was different in Myanmar. In Taiwan, the relationship is complex with because Taiwan was it never received separate statehood. It came under China, and the relationship was complex, and it had been a British colony for a long time. And the Chinese government always expected that the people should have undivided loyalty for the People's Republic of China, not for any other state or not for the host country. So there, the relationship with the homeland, with the place of origin, was quite complicated and different from the rest of the Chinese diasporic societies. And the next diasporic society that we will be discussing is the African diaspora. Here you will see that this has been created because of movements of Africans to USA, Canada, South America, Europe, and Asia. And as I told you earlier, this movement has mostly been forced. it was during the slave trade, the times of slave trade that took place in these continents, that these Africans were carried in, sometimes they were deceived, sometimes they were kidnapped, sometimes they were, you know, shown a idea of a good opportunity coming up. And again, they were victims, and at the same time, the diasporic community in Africa is a result of colonialism. They were not the ancient kind of diasporic historical community like the Chinese or the Jewish. And there is this African Union who defined the African diaspora as a people of African origin living outside the continent. So basically, how many countries would be, nation states would be there in the continent of Africa? We do not, we just look at Africa as a single, nation. We don't try to discriminate between an Ethiopian or an Ugandan or, a Kenyan. We don't look at it. And because, when these movements are taken place also, nobody could actually make these distinctions. And over the generations, over the years, they could only remember that okay, they belong to some part of Africa, that they are people of African origin and who have been brought as slaves to these industrialized countries. And after few generations, they have always led a life of being discriminated against, of being victims of diaspora. And today, what they remember is this continent, the continent of the origin. And that's the reason the African Union is actually denoting African diaspora not on the basis of nation state, but on the basis of this entire continent. So, in case of African society, the linkages and connections with homeland still appears more complicated. There are different stories of Africa, different parts of Africa which needs to be explored further. There many, huge literature on that, but still more needs to be explored in order to understand the complicacy of the African diaspora. They are different from the Jews, they're different from the Chinese. They were not the historic diasporas, they are the modern diaspora. They were the victims of colonialism. And here I'll give you an example. Say a West African, who was, chained, was fettered and carried to Jamaica as a slave. And then once the plantation job was there, the master took him to London, say in Britain, to be a servant there for after several years. And if you look at the identity of the person, who is he? After few generations, would he be able to call himself an African, a Jamaican, or a British? So you will see that, even if you're talking about the diasporic community of of one place of origin, say one nation state, they will also have diverse experience because, you know there has been, the troubles and the pains and sufferings that they have undergone, it is so very distinct. And the kind of cultural patterns that each of these communities, even if they are a same community because they belong to the same place of origin, the in the host country the patterns have been found different, because diasporic experience is never homogeneous. And the way they relate to the homeland, whether it is a real homeland or an imaginary homeland, is also different, because it also depends on the place of origin, the place of their homeland, as to how the state looks at their diaspora. Today we look at the Indian diaspora as not as a liability, but as I mentioned earlier, it is a brain bank. We do not talk in terms of brain drain, because we have changed our perception, because they bring FDIs. So how does the homeland look at this diaspora? And it's their own experience of being in the host country, their own imagination of their homeland, and the networking that is woven around them, and at the same time the kind of environment they are located at. whether they are being discriminated by the natives or they have been assimilated, or the connections, what kind of connections they maintain with their homeland. This all these things they go into the construction of a diasporic community. So thank you. I just want to take a few questions. Whatever doubt you have, uh, you can ask me right now. Any doubts? No. I had actually kept 10 minutes for doubt clarification, but I don't see any. So, shall we stop here or any doubts coming up for today's session? Nothing? Okay, so for tomorrow's session, I will take up block 2, where we will be again specifying on the experiences of the Indian diaspora, the trends that is seen among the Indian diaspora, the migration patterns, and some of the unique cultural formations that has emerged among them in different countries. Okay.
Ma'am, ma'am,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
clarification.
Yes.
Presently, after the Modi government, we see there is a lot of changes with respect to the different development uh,
Mm-hmm.
within the Indian diaspora. So he's going to different country and reviving the, say, economy or whatever. So shall we be also be touching those aspects, or will
If,
be?
of course, because as I told you, I talked to you about three phases of diaspora, Indian diaspora. So the
Right.
third page was about the post-globalized era, that where we would be actually talking about the present
Upla.
scenario, and and I'm really doubtful, after this pandemic COVID cases coming up, this idea of diaspora, it will also have an immense change. Maybe we can also have these newer elements, nuances in our discussion, the
Right,
last
right.
pages of the classes. So we'll keep the discussion, this discussion till the, after 2 or 3 sessions, we can take it up when we will be taking up the final stages of the diaspora discourses.
Okay, ma'am.
Anything else? Any clarification in today's lecture?
No, ma'am. It was easy to understand. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Is
Thank
there
you,
anybody's
sir.
any other question? I mean, dear learners, I just want to tell you one thing. Number is very less. Today, the particularly, I mean, at least 20 joining. Today, only 7 people is there. What happened to other students? Because you old students know each other, na? You tell your friends they should join. Ma'am is teaching so well, but your number is very less. So, anybody's any questions? So thank you, ma'am. I mean,
Thank you, sir.
it's a really very good presentation. So, ma'am, you put your presentation in the WhatsApp group. Okay.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, sir. I'll
So
do that.
whatever I mean, WhatsApp, I mean, present slides you made it. So you just put it in
Mm-hmm.
the WhatsApp because you are the admin in the group. So you can put it that I mean slides in the WhatsApp group. Okay.
Okay, sir. I'll do
So
that.
with this course, I thank you very much to Mohanty ma'am. So dear learners, I do feel tomorrow more number of students will join. So the class will be very effective. With these words, so I conclude today's session. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Select the tab, meet dash F tab, hit item tab, remove tab, hit lip tab, remove the tab, hit K tab, remove K tab, hit Z tab, remove the tab, show part tab, chat with us tab, pictures tab, details tab, turn off mic tab, leave call tab, turn on tab, present now tab, more options button, menu command enter, expanded, menu, more options button enter. Stop recording.